we're going to really go to two parts of the program, and a little bit of a side trip into the item cost report. But the main things we're going to be talking about are all the options, or some of the options in the job extensions and the job totals, the things you do after you've finished your takeoff and putting it into EBM, whether you do it electronically or whether you input it manually. These are the kind of things you'll be able to use after you've done all the input and are ready to start analyzing the numbers. So we're going to start with job extensions, talk about some of the things there. We'll go to job totals, and we'll finish up with the item cost report. Questions are welcome anywhere. I'll probably pause a couple times and ask for questions, but if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and when I see that, it comes up on my screen up there in the right part, just like it does on yours, and I'll know that you have a question, and I'll find a time to pause. So we'll get going here. This is, of course, the main screen you see when you bring up Electrical Bid Manager. So I'm just going to load a job here. This is the job, by the way, that we use, or that we do in our EBM lab class. Now, back in the days of in-person classes, this was a class where we pass out a complete set of drawings. It's about, I think it's 10 pages. It's about 11,000 square foot commercial building. It's got some site work. It's got all the typical interior work with lighting and power. It even has fire alarm. And on the site, there's utilities, primary, secondary, and parking lot lighting. So it's a pretty well-rounded job. It gives people the opportunity to see just about every part of the bid. So I'm going to open up that job called Acme Facility. So again, we've finished our takeoff, and now we're ready to look at the numbers. So the first thing you want to do always is go to Reports and go to Job Extension. Now, I know a lot of people have got maybe in a bad habit or didn't know better that they go to job totals first, and the mistake in doing that is you won't have any chance of seeing mistakes, numbers that are out of line. You really always want to run the job extension first. So I'm going to click here, and first time I'm going to run it without any of the options that we're going to talk about after that. So this is the way it will come up typically. You'll have the target price set here, and you'll have labor set to column 2. Now we're going to talk about the other price columns and some other options there in a minute, as well as the labor columns. But for now, I'm just going to do a standard extension spreadsheet. Now this won't come up the first time you do it, but since I've been playing with this job, it's going to, on your system, the first time you run an extension, it's going to default to default. And what the default job extension does by phase is it groups all the materials in these categories, these groups of materials, starting with underground feeder raceway, going to underground branch raceway, all the way down to your above ground feeders, etc. And then down at the bottom are your totals. These two numbers at the bottom, I always emphasize that these are really important because they're pulled into your final summary. On this particular job, there's $40,713 in material. That does not include sales tax, does not include any quoted items, doesn't include anything else you would finalize in the totals of the summary. And this is total hours of labor. Now, if you're going to print this report, which I like to recommend you do, I would print a hard copy. If you come down here to preview report, that's what it's going to look like if you print a hard copy. And then I would also maybe recommend that you save it with the save button as a PDF file. You can save or create PDF files by either going directly to save, or when you go to the printer icon, there's always an option to print to PDF. Okay, so we've got our totals here. Let's go back to job extension and look at a couple other options here. This is kind of an interesting one I ran across just over the last couple of weeks. I've been working with a customer who uses the program in Barbados, of all places. And basically, he needs to add 100% factor to the U.S. prices, because that's what it ends up costing him by the time he pays duties and prices in his area. So he puts 100% factor there. Now, you have an option here to save the factor, so the next time you come back here, it'll remember that number. And you have an option to print the factor. The reason there's an option to print that is that maybe you're submitting this to someone else who you don't want to see that you put a a markup here. So that's the other place that people use this factor. Kind of a 2 or 3 reasons you do that. One is just to increase the price of material. Another might be to factor in if you're expecting price increases. You can add an extra little margin there, 5, 10, 15%, whatever you think is appropriate. Maybe you've got to hold this bid for 30 days or 3 or 4 months. You might want to put a price factor there to cover price changes. And again, some people do it because just to give them a little extra cushion. So my customer in Barbados does it for just to take care of the differences in what he pays for the materials. So again, if you don't want that factor printed, maybe you're submitting this to someone who you don't want to know that you've built that markup in, then you can uncheck that. So I'm going to hit Extension Spreadsheet. I'm going to just save it as default again. We'll talk about naming these in just a minute. So basically, it's the same job, and all the prices have been doubled. 100% is double the markup. Some people go the other direction. Maybe they think the prices out of Epic are a little high. They might shave a little percentage there too. So that's what the factoring is about. It's a pretty powerful feature here. Now, the other option with the price column, one is the trade price. So we use that a lot of the time for change orders. Matter of fact, when you create a change order, it automatically defaults to the trade price. So I'm going to save the factor again. I'm going to print the factor on the report. And I'm going to hit Extension Spreadsheet. And I'm going to save it to default again. So when we did it with the target price, the total was about 40,000. And when we did it with 100% markup, I think it was about 81,000. If you go to the trade price, it's actually more than double on this particular job. Now, of course, it depends on the mix of materials that are in the job, but you can see why using the trade price on a change order is really advantageous. Okay, so let's go back to the real world again. We're going to change it back to the target price. I won't put a factor, so I don't need to check those boxes. Now, you have 2 other options here. One is what we call custom pricing. And I don't want to get too far off the topic here, but custom pricing is where you set up a price download with your local supplier or suppliers. You can have as many as you want. So they send you a file that has all their pricing in their inventory. It's got UPC numbers on everything, and then it loads into Epic. So every item that they give you a price on will have a target price in Epic. It'll have a trade price on Epic, and it'll have the supplier's price in Epic. And let me just bring up Epic real quick to show you what I mean. So I've got some prices, I think it's from a gray bar branch in Florida. I'll just go to Conduit and Fittings, EMT, and Conduit. So I've set up this gray bar column in Epic. You can see the prices are pretty close to the target price. Usually, I think on all cases, they're a little bit lower. So in EBM, if I want to use that supplier, I didn't mean to click that. I meant to toggle back to EBM. I would change it up here to the gray bar Florida prices. Now, this time I'm going to name this because I want to save this separate from my regular default pricing. So I'm going to hit Save As. Now, I've already set up one called gray bar, but you could type that in here. And then it'll save this report with its own name. And probably the most important thing to understand is it creates a separate summary. So I can look at the job with my default target pricing, or I can look at it with my gray bar pricing. I'm going to overwrite what was there. Probably won't change. So remember, the target pricing was about 41,000. With gray bar pricing, we're at 35,000. So that's a pretty good little drop. Again, if you'd like to pursue getting custom pricing set up, typically the suppliers won't charge you for that. And they might update you weekly, monthly. A lot of them just provide it online 24/7. You can go in and download it when you need it. Takes a little bit of help maybe to get that set up, but we can definitely help people get that set up. Now the other option is something called Net Pricer. kind of similar, but not really the same. Net pricer is, again, something you set up with your local suppliers. Now, this one you have to pay for. It's typically not free. But what this is an online on-demand pricing. So with the job that you've selected, let me go back to Target here. I'm going to tell it to use, I have a supplier, I think that's an abbreviation for the supplier in Maryland. It's just a fictitious one or practice one, if you will. So I'm going to use this local supplier's pricing. And what happens here, same thing happens with the custom pricing. If the price or the item isn't in their system, it'll still default to the target price. So you're covered either way. So I'm going to use this supplier here, and I'm going to hit Extension Spreadsheet, and I'm going to save it under that name. So I've done this actually 3 different ways now. I'm going to help to overwrite. So here's where it actually goes and gets the prices through the net pricer server to the local supplier's pricing, and it comes back and prices everything that it. So this on this job, which has about 80 items, 12 of them weren't in the supplier's inventory. That doesn't count quoted items or temporary items, that kind of thing. But of all the regular items, all the bread and butter items, all but 12 were priced. You can view what those are with View Report. I won't do that now. I'm just going to hit OK. And we'll see what the totals are again. All the way down the bottom. So that's kind of in between. So target again was about 41,000. This supplier is about 38,000, and my gray bar pricing from the Florida branch was about 35, 36,000. So I think those are real good options to have, not only before you finalize your bid. There, maybe this is useful. If you win the bid, now you can come back and start looking at different options on how much money you might save. You can look at the options there. At least it gives you an idea of how much money you've got to play with, especially if you're negotiating a job. So those are the basically 4 options on the price columns. You've got the target price, the trade price, custom pricing from a local supplier, and the net pricer pricing. I'm going to set it back to target just one more time. And hit save. And we're back now to the 41,000. I think we've got a question here. Let's take a quick look before I go on to the next topic. I already answered the question. The question was, if net pricer does not pick up a price, what column is used in its place? It uses the target price. So, good question. Okay. Let's talk just a minute about the labor columns. In case you don't know the background on those, there's 3 standard columns in EBM. Doesn't matter what version you have, that comes with 3 columns of labor. Column 1 is the lowest and column 3 is the highest. So the idea here is we're trying to identify the overall difficulty. Column 2 is typically the default. That's a pretty good average number for new commercial construction. Again, I say new as opposed to remodel or industrial or that kind of thing. And typically, I think most people find there's a little bit of cushion there. Some people think they need a little more cushion, or that number may be a little higher or a little low. I'll tell you how to adjust for that in a minute. But column 2 is, I get pretty equal feedback. I think most people will tell you that if they think it's a little higher or a little low, it's about equal numbers on both sides. Column 1 is the lowest. I don't typically like to use that number unless I've got a job where it's A, easy, B, there's a lot of repetition, like an apartment complex or something, and C, all the other factors are good, like maybe you've got your best crew available, weather's not an issue, general contractor's good, all of the things that just don't typically happen together would be the only reason I would go down to column 1. Column 3 is the highest. It's actually based on the NECA standard labor columns. NECA, National Electrical Contractors Association, has published a labor manual for, I don't know now, probably 60, 70, 80 years. Everybody understands the numbers in that labor manual are high. They're roughly double what's in column 1. So it's great for change orders, something you might want to use again on industrial work, very difficult jobs. I also think about it coming into play with a small job. You get a job with 50, 60, 70, 80 hours. The time it takes to set up, stage the job, clean up, etc., often is just, almost as much as the actual work itself. Now, if one of those 3 doesn't work, there's a couple options here. You can say, well, this job's just a little more difficult than normal. I can put 10% adder. Again, if I want to save that so that it saves it from this point on in the job. And again, if I want to print that, probably would want to print it if I'm not submitting it to somebody else just for internal uses. You can print the factor on the report. Now, the other option is columns 4, 5, and 6. Some people create their own labor columns. If you want to create a column 4 that's 25% higher than column 3, you can go into the database. There's a utility to do that, or you could just do it for the job. You can say add 25% onto column 3. So lots of ways to factor the job. Now, this is a global thing at this point. We'll talk about how to narrow that down a little bit in a few minutes. But at this point, the price of the material is global throughout the job, and the labor is also overall for the job. I tend to look at jobs more like that way, but I know a lot of people get a little more specific. Maybe they want to factor just the feeder wire. Maybe they want to factor just the lighting, labor on the lighting. Those are things you can do. I'm going to leave it on column 2 for now. I'm going to leave it on 0 factor, so we don't need to check these boxes. And we'll hit Extension Spreadsheet. Actually, let's go do that with column 3 just for the sake of doing it, just so you see the difference. We'll do it all 3 columns. So column 2 is 1169. Now we're going to go to column 1. If I don't name it here, it's still going to save it under default. That's fine. So by going from column 2 to column 1, I had some open items there. Okay. So labor drops down all the way down to about 10% less. That's what you'll typically see. Now, if I go up to column 3, if you're doing a change order, it automatically defaults to column 3. It's probably going to ask me for a couple things here again. So column 3, we're going to be 1900. Not quite double column 1, but pretty close. Again, that may vary a little bit depending on the mix of materials. We didn't base our column 1 and 2 strictly on NECA, but you'll find that that's about the typical spread. Okay, let's go back to a more typical situation. We'll change it back to column 2. Hit Extension Spreadsheet. Save it as default again. Okay, so good point for good. This would be a good point to ask any questions about factoring the job in the extensions before you go to the job totals. Okay, so let's go to job totals on the left. Now, if you do go back to the job, maybe change some, you could even change quantities in the audit trail, make changes in the audit trail. And I want to mention that first, actually, because I see this happen quite a bit. I see people go into the audit trail to make changes in the, like the prices or labor units or anything in particular. They'll try to find the item, which is not easy in the audit trail because it's only arranged typically by the order you put things in. If you change the price on this 3/4 inch PVC conduit, it will be reflected in the job, but it's not the easiest place to do it. I'm just going to change it for the heck of it. So if I go run my reports in job extension, even if I skip job extension, which not probably the best practice, I'm going to and go to job totals, that'll update again. You can see that number drop just go up a little bit. So again, the non-quoted material, this 40,000, comes from the job extension. The hours, 1169, that came from the job extension. So those are the two numbers we're feeding into the final summary. We call it job totals. You might hear it referred to as the final summary, the job summary, or the recap, the recapitulation. That's kind of the old school terminology for that. Here's another thing I've run across that is handy. Let's just say, for example, I've taken off some feeders here. And I want to see how much money I have in for the feeders. Now I got to find them first. And there's a search button here. I know on this job there's a panel P1. So I'm going to search for P1. There it is. That's the feeder I was looking for. Here's the panel, the feeder from the MDP to PP1. I'm going to maximize that. Give me a second. And then there's another feeder to PP2. So let's just say I want to get a quick total on those two feeders without running any special reports. I can just highlight them in the audit trail. So that's the entries. There we go. And then you hit quick totals at the bottom. I suggested this to somebody recently. They were trying to do some quick unit pricing, didn't want to go back and create a report for, just what it costs to do one duplex receptacle or one 2x4 lane or that kind of thing. But those two feeders are $2,573. No markup. If I wanted to know the cost per foot on this feeder, for example, I would highlight it, hit quick totals. So that's $1,348. Now the feeder was 120 feet long, so I would divide 1,348.60 by 120, and I'd have a cost per foot. And if they want that as a unit price, put some markup in there and you're ready to go. Let's talk about the job totals though. So if you want to factor the job a little more narrowly than just saying I want to add 20% to the entire job, maybe I want to add 20% labor to just the lighting. You go here where it says labor and direct, and there's a whole column of percentages here. So if I want to add, let's say 25% to the lighting, that's all you do. Maybe I think the feeders in this job are going to be really easy. I could put minus 10%. Okay. You could also just change the number of hours up here. Sometimes people do that. They say that 1169, I just want to change it to 1100. You can do that. Watch out for typos here. Trying to type in 1100. There we go. And it'll tell you that you overrode the number when they you go back to that report. So I'm going to change it back to here. I'll leave those factors in for now. But that's how you can factor the labor by category. And it tells you that. That's what this little note is telling me, that overall I've adjusted the labor in the job up 5%. And if I want to see where that was done, I would just look back at this report and you'll see the individual factors. I'm going to change it back just to keep it clean. Change that back to 0. To 0. Now these next three categories are all kind of similar. Direct job expenses. Typically, we're putting in actual numbers here. If you can come up with an estimate of the permit, if you need to do that, you put it in here. Things like temporary power, temporary lighting's down there further. Now, trenching and backhoe are interesting because maybe you own a trencher, maybe you own a backhoe. You still want to put some money in here to cover wear and tear on your own equipment. And as a budget number, I would look at what it would cost to rent the equipment for the same amount of time and plug in that number or something at least close to that number so that you're taking care of the wear and tear on the job. Now, some people use factors for miscellaneous materials. I have no problem with that. I don't care how careful and thorough your estimate is, there's going to be things that you don't account for. It could just be things that get lost, get stolen, get used up on the job, etc. So some people come down here and put a percentage on the job. Some people apply it to material. Some people apply it just to labor. If you want to apply it to the entire job, which is probably a little more, makes a little more sense, then you would just put a percentage here. And I see numbers like 2 to 5% here. I'm going to put 3% on the job. Looks like we might have another question here. Question is there a way to change the price of material for just one takeoff? Actually, that's what it does unless you tell it otherwise. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you change the price or the labor on 4-inch PVC within the job, unless you tell it otherwise, it's only changed within the job. So that's kind of the default, the way it normally works. So on your tools and miscellaneous materials, again, you can either itemize them, you can put a percentage in, or you can throw a lump sum in at the end with the top part here. Now, subcontracts come into play if you're subbing out the fire alarm. Now, on this particular job we did in class, we decided to actually do the fire alarm. So we put a quote in. Yeah, that's a good, so if you're subbing it out, this is where you would put it right here. Now, that's a good thing to talk about as quotes for a minute. And somebody brought this up to me earlier. What customer pointed this out. A lot of the time people will come in here and plug some numbers in on the top part of the screen as an itemized quote, because it's very difficult to get those from the supplier. But if you're just trying to get a budget together, you can plug them in here, and you can even indicate that that's a budget or a guess. Now be careful. And again, this is the concern. If you plug numbers in here and the overall total is lower than your supplier, let's say our supplier gave us a quote of 39,000, it's going to use his number, the 38,510, unless I tell it otherwise. So at the point you actually get a real quote from a supplier and they're higher than your guess, then you need to come down here and say use gray bar, even though they're not the lowest. It'll always default to the lowest. It'll never default to one that's zero. So on this job, we plugged in a fire alarm quote. Try that again. And we did as the lump sum down here. Again, the two scenarios with fire alarm are either you only do the boxes and conduit stubs, or you're actually gonna just sub out the actual fire alarm installation, the wiring and the devices and the programming. Or if you're doing it yourself, the program will take care of the labor to put the devices in, the labor and cost of the wire, boxes, etc. And all you got to do is plug in the quote from the supplier, the fire alarm supplier, which would typically include the programming as well. Think of it just like lighting. You know, you get a lighting quote. Lighting wholesaler doesn't install the material, but same idea. Okay. Overhead and profit, there's really one thing I want to mention there. The most common way to do here is to put a percentage on the entire job. I'm going to put 12% overhead, 10% profit. People always ask me, what kind of numbers do you see here? On overhead, I see anywhere from 8 to 15, sometimes 20%. On profit, I see more like 5 to 10, 15% in those ranges. You really need to look at a lot of things here, but one of them is the overall size of the job. You don't want to do a really small job for a small amount of overhead and profit. I guess the reverse is true. You might be a little more willing to take a smaller percentage on overhead and profit if it's a really big job. The other thing I always like to look at here is the difficulty of the job. I don't want to do a very difficult, very small job for a small markup. That's not the best way to go. So those are some of the things I think about here. You know, tracking your bids is really important. If you can't get the general contractor or whoever you're bidding to give you feedback, then that tells you you're probably wasting your time. They're probably shopping your prices. Now, the other option, a couple things to think about here. What about jobs where the material, the quota material, like the lighting, sometimes even the switch gear, is furnished by the owner? So when you put this 12% markup here, you're losing your markup on your lighting. So one thing I do there, people do, is they take whatever they think the lighting package is worth, $50,000, and then they figure out what the markup would have been. 10% overhead, 10% profit on 50,000 is about a little over $10,000. So you could actually put that in. You might even put it down here on the bond just to use a filler, because when you put numbers down here, they don't get overhead and profit. Or you could just adjust your actual bid price. Instead of 203,000, you might go to 214,000. Add in that extra markup that you didn't get on your material, because when the owner provides the material on part of the job, you're still obviously doing the same amount of work, and maybe it's even a little less, a little more of a challenge because you don't have control over it. They're purchasing the lighting and are responsible for the complete lighting package with all the stuff that's supposed to come with it. You kind of lose control of that. So you really need to account for that with your markup. And that's why we have these options here to either mark it up by category. So you could put a bigger markup on your non-quoted material. The other thing people look at here too is a lot of people put more markup on the labor because they feel, and I agree, that the labor is really the critical part of the job. If we just trade dollars on material, but we make a good profit on our labor, then we're being compensated for running the job well. Now, here's the other option I've seen, and I really like this option. A lot of contractors feel that what drives the overhead is the labor. So that's what you have to manage, is the majority of your overhead is going to be directed at managing the labor in the field. So what they do is they look at the total dollars of labor that are spent each month. Let's say it's $200,000, and they look at the they look at the total hours of labor that are paid each month. So if they've got 10 guys and they each work 200 hours a month, that's 2,000 hours. And they take the overhead and divide it into that. So they know how many dollars it takes per hour to pay the overhead. One of the companies I worked with looked at that number every month. At the end of the month, that's the first thing they did, was see what was our overhead per hour. I think their number was somewhere in the 18 range. So I would put it on productive and non-productive. And that way you're just putting the overhead on the labor. You could also put something on the material, but this is really the critical one, putting your overhead on the labor and keeping a good eye on what that number is. When you print this, it'll take that 14.74% and break it out in more detail. So here's my $18 an hour, amounts to $21,000. I didn't put any overhead on the material, I just put it on labor. So that 14.74 is kind of it is a weighted average of all the overheads, but just applied to labor as a percentage. Okay. The point of these pop-up webinars is really to keep it focused on a specific part of the program. So we wanted to deal with just the stuff that you deal with when you're crunching the numbers at the end. I do have one more thing I want to point out, and this is a tool that I don't think enough people know about, and it really can save you making a big mistake sometimes. It's this option called the item cost report. I was working with just somebody again last week, and somehow they had accidentally changed the prices on their boxes from $2 and something to $20 and something. So when you run the item cost report and tell it to sort by price, it's going to put the items with the highest dollar amount at the top. This job has some concrete pole bases. That's the first item. There's a mistake right there. We've got 400 MC connectors at $12 a piece. That's a pretty expensive connector. I'd expect to see things like wire, 350 MCM, number 10 wire. We used 12-2 aluminum clad MC cable on the job. Those are the kind of things you expect to see up here, 3/4 inch EMD. So to fix that item, that 62099, didn't even notice that before. You close the report and you go back to job extension. Now, if you remember the number or write it down, you can hit edit by item number, which is down at the bottom, I think. I'll maximize that. For some reason, my screen's cutting off the bottom. Let's come down here. We'll just search for it. Yeah, I've got something wrong with my screen setting, so I can't see the search button, but we'll find it. Brown branch raceway. That'll be with the above ground wire. There it is, right there. So I'm going to change that. I suspect somebody probably changed it accidentally, but we'll tell it to put in 75 cents for the connector and refresh it. So again, the item cost report is going to help you find those things that you may have accidentally edited. Could be just a mistake in the pricing or labor units in your database. The other thing that it helps, even if all the numbers are right, it helps you pinpoint the critical items in the job. So we know on this job, these first 4 or 5 items are the big ticket items that we may want to go and get some pricing from a local supplier, maybe get a quote to hold the price on my 350 MCM wire for 30 days. Those are my critical items here. That's the item cost report. It can really save you if you're making a mistake, because the program doesn't know if you put the wrong quantity in. You put in 1,000 feet of something instead of 100. Doesn't know if you changed the price, forget the decimal point, or put the wrong unit of measure. There's lots of ways to make mistakes. The program won't make a math mistake. I think that's virtually impossible, but it doesn't prevent us as the users from making mistakes.